12-year-old Honda is now more desirable than many brand new cars. That sounds insane until you understand what changed. It isn't nostalgia. It's economics, incentives, and a hard repairability cutoff most buyers never saw coming. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which side of that cutoff your next car is on. Before we unpack how this happened, let's look at a few rules about cars that stopped being true over a decade ago. Rule number 1, repairs scaled with the value of the car. Rule number 2, complexity added comfort, not dependency. Rule number 3, independent shops could fix most problems. Rule number 4, major failures gave warnings. Rule number 5, ownership meant control. When newer is better was actually true. For a long time, the idea that newer cars were better wasn't marketing. It was just true. If you rewind to the late 1990s through the early 2010s, progress in cars was predictable. Each generation got a little safer, a little quieter, a little more refined, without changing what ownership actually felt like. Take something like a mid-2000s Honda Accord or Toyota Corolla. Nothing exotic. The engines were simple, naturally aspirated, and understressed. Automatic transmissions weren't brilliant, but they were understandable. Manuals were everywhere. You could open the hood and immediately recognize what you were looking at. When something went wrong, it made sense. A water pump would start leaking. A clutch would slip. A suspension arm would knock over bumps. You'd notice it. You'd drive it for a while, then you'd decide whether to fix it. And the math usually worked. Spending $800 or $1,200 on a repair for a 10-year-old car didn't feel crazy because the car would reliably give you another 5 years. You weren't gambling, you were extending its life. Independent shops thrived in this era for a reason. Parts were everywhere. Diagnostics didn't require a login. If one shop didn't want the job, another would. Even if you never touched a wrench yourself, you still had options. That's why buying newer felt safe. You weren't just paying for nicer interiors or better fuel economy. You were buying time. Time before the next repair. Time before the next decision. And that confidence wasn't naive, it was earned. It came from how cars were actually built back then. What changed wasn't that cars suddenly became worse. It's that this logic, the one that made newer cars a safe bet, stopped applying. And most buyers didn't notice until much later. The moment the curve bent. What changed wasn't one bad car or one disastrous model year. That's why most people missed it. The shift didn't arrive loudly. It crept in, disguised as progress. Around the mid-2010s, cars stopped evolving in a straight line. Instead of refining proven systems, manufacturers began redesigning them to satisfy new pressures. Tighter emissions rules, aggressive fuel economy targets, global platform sharing, and cost optimization. Each made sense on its own. Together, they changed everything. Engines got smaller and more stressed. A 2.4-liter naturally aspirated engine replaced by a 1.4-liter turbo doing twice the work. Components once comfortably overbuilt were redesigned to the edge. Service items quietly became lifetime parts, not because they lasted forever, but because servicing them no longer fit the design. Failures didn't disappear, they just arrived later and hit harder. Electronics shifted too. Cars didn't just get more computers, they got fewer, bigger ones. Multiple systems were folded into single modules, efficient on paper, fragile in practice. That's where the curve bent. A bad sensor stopped being a nuisance and started triggering limp mode, warnings everywhere, or total shutdowns. Diagnosing problems became less about skill and more about access. Parts delays stretched. Cars sat waiting. Real choices vanished. On paper, the cars looked better than ever. In reality, the ownership math had already changed, and most people didn't realize it until they were standing at a service counter staring at a bill that didn't make sense. The incentive mismatch. Here's the uncomfortable part. This didn't happen because manufacturers forgot how to build durable cars. It happened because long-term durability stopped being what anyone gets rewarded for. Modern car design now lives at the intersection of emissions rules, cost control, and global platform efficiency. Manufacturers are judged on fleet averages, compliance targets, and assembly simplicity. How a car behaves at year 12 or 15 isn't a failure in that system. It's irrelevant. Dealers changed too. As cars became more software-driven and tightly integrated, repair access moved behind proprietary tools and permissions. Diagnosing or recalibrating parts increasingly requires authorization. That didn't require bad intentions, it just required locking complexity behind permission. And once that happened, control quietly shifted. Owners are the ones left adapting. When something goes wrong, the question isn't what broke anymore. It's who's allowed to touch it. A repairable problem becomes a dead end, not because the part can't be fixed, but because fixing it isn't permitted. That's where incentives split. A car that performs flawlessly through the warranty period is a success for manufacturers. Complexity increases dependence for dealers. And for anyone planning to keep a car long-term, that same complexity becomes exposure. This isn't going unnoticed. There's even a bipartisan bill in Congress right now, the Repair Act, because lawmakers are starting to realize ownership doesn't mean much if permission is required to fix what you supposedly own. The system is working exactly as designed, just not for people who expected ownership to last longer than the warranty. Once you see that misalignment, a lot of modern car behavior suddenly stops being confusing. The repairability line. This is where everything snaps into focus. For decades, car ownership followed a simple rule. When something broke, you compared the repair costs to the value of the car. If it made sense, you fixed it. If it didn't, you moved on. That balance worked because most failures were small and isolated. What changed isn't that cars break more, it's how they break. Older cars wear out in pieces. A water pump leaks, a clutch slips, a suspension joint knocks. You notice it, live with it, then decide. Even big jobs come with warning and time to plan. Modern cars fail as systems. One fault can trigger limp mode, warnings everywhere, or partial shutdowns. Fixing it often means replacing an entire module, not a single part. That's where the repairability line appears. Suddenly, one failure costs thousands, not because the part is exotic, but because access, programming, and authorization are bundled in. The car may still be mechanically fine, but the math collapses. That's the real shift. The car didn't wear out, the repair path did. And once you see that, it's easy to understand why buyers are gravitating toward cars that stay safely on the other side of that line, even if they're 10 or 15 years old. Why 10 to 15-year-old cars suddenly got expensive. Once you see where the repairability line sits, the used car market stops looking irrational. The surge in prices for 10 to 15-year-old cars isn't nostalgia, and it's not just pandemic hangover. It's a correction. Buyers are quietly recalculating which cars can realistically stay on the road without one repair ending the relationship. And when enough people reach the same conclusion, prices move fast. Cars from this era land in a very specific sweet spot. They're new enough to feel modern, airbags everywhere, stability control, decent crash structures, Bluetooth, but old enough that a single fault doesn't take the entire car hostage. Parts are still widely available. Independent shops still have access. Diagnostics still tell a story instead of issuing ultimatums. This is why mileage has quietly become less important than people think. A well-maintained 150,000-mile car that wears out gradually can be a safer long-term bet than a lower mileage car that fails all at once. A $900 repair you can plan for is very different from a $6,000 decision you didn't see coming. Buyers usually learn this the hard way. One uneconomical repair. One car parked up waiting on parts. One bill that doesn't make sense. Then the advice starts circulating. From mechanics, from friends, from owners who've been burned. That's how demand concentrates. So yes, prices feel crazy, but they're not rising because these cars are perfect. They're rising because they still behave like machines, not platforms. You can budget for them, you can keep them going, and when the time finally comes, you decide when ownership ends, instead of having that decision made for you by a single non-negotiable failure. That shift in thinking is what's reshaping the market, whether buyers consciously label it or not. EVs and the time horizon. Electric vehicles complicate this picture, and this is where a lot of people start feeling uneasy, even if they can't quite explain why. EVs solve real problems. They're quiet, they're smooth, they're mechanically simple in obvious ways. For the first few years, many of them are genuinely great to live with. That part isn't controversial. The problem isn't ideology, it's time. Every EV is built around a large lithium-ion battery, and batteries are consumable. They degrade with age, charge cycles, heat, cold, and how they're used. The exact timeline varies, but the direction doesn't. Eventually, capacity loss crosses from annoying to limiting. When that happens, the ownership math changes fast. A battery replacement isn't a normal repair, it's a system swap. And even as prices slowly come down, it's still a large concentrated cost that tends to show up late in the car's life, right when everything else is still working fine. That's the moment a lot of owners quietly exit. This doesn't mean EVs are disposable by definition, but it does mean they have a clearer expiration curve than most internal combustion cars ever did. The end of ownership is more predictable and more abrupt. That's not a problem if you lease. It is a problem if you plan to keep the car. That matters because it places EVs firmly on one side of the repairability line. They can be excellent during their prime years, but long-term survivability depends far more on battery economics than on gradual mechanical wear. You don't have to hate EVs to see the issue. You just have to think past the warranty period, which is exactly what more buyers are starting to do. The independence argument. When people say old cars were better, this is usually what they're circling, even if they never put it into words. It's not really about nostalgia. It's not about hating touchscreens or wishing it were still 1998. It's about independence. Older, simpler cars give you leverage. You decide when something gets fixed. You decide who touches it. You decide whether a repair is worth doing or whether you're done with the car. That leverage is disappearing. Not because drivers suddenly forgot how cars work, but because modern systems leave less room to decide. Software locks, integrated modules, and dealer-only permissions mean fewer exits. When something fails, there is often one approved fix, one approved pathway, and one price. Take it or leave it. That changes how ownership feels. The car no longer adapts to you. You adapt to it. You're not managing wear and tear anymore. You're negotiating access. And the moment you stop complying, the car stops cooperating. For a lot of buyers, that is the real breaking point. Not the cost by itself, but the loss of agency. The feeling that the car chooses when the relationship ends, not you. This is why repairability hits such a nerve. It isn't just a mechanical preference, it's psychological. People want cars that age alongside them, not platforms that quietly eject them when the math turns against them. Once that clicks, the appeal of simpler, pre-lock-in cars becomes obvious, even if they are older, slower, or less impressive on a spec sheet. After everything we've talked about, I'm curious, what was the last stick-shift car you actually drove? Drop the make, model, and year and a short memory in the comments. I read them all. Let's see how many folks still remember the feel of rowing their own gears in an era where automatics and now EVs dominate. What to do now? This isn't a call to panic, and it's not an argument for slamming the brakes on progress. It's about making cleaner decisions with open eyes. If you're shopping today, the mistake isn't buying something new or old. It's buying without understanding where the repairability line sits. Instead of asking which car has the most features or the best numbers on paper, the more useful question is simple. What happens when this car breaks? And when it does, do you still have real choices? Cars that stay on the right side of that line tend to share a few traits. Their problems show up gradually. Their systems can be diagnosed without special permission. Parts can be replaced without rewriting the car's identity. And when repairs happen, the costs make sense relative to the value of the car. That doesn't mean every older car is a smart buy. It means age alone isn't the risk people think it is. Architecture matters more than year. Repair pathways matter more than horsepower. And simplicity here isn't about being outdated. It's about being resilient. The owners who end up happiest long-term aren't chasing trends or headlines. They're buying cars they can live with, maintain, and walk away from on their own terms. Once you adopt that mindset, the market stops feeling chaotic and starts feeling readable again. Closing the loop. At the start of this video, we talked about a line that car market quietly crossed. Now you can see exactly where it is. This was never about old versus new, or gas versus electric. It's about whether a car stays economically survivable as it ages, or whether one failure ends the story early. That's why 10 to 15-year-old cars suddenly look expensive. Not because they're flawless, but because they still let owners decide when they're done. And once you see where that line moved, you don't shop the same way again. Because you're no longer guessing, you're choosing.